All right, we're ready for 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let's review where we've been in the first 4 chapters, and then we'll get underway with our text in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Chapter 1 was about, Paul's charge concerning sound doctrine. Timothy is to teach sound doctrine and charge others to teach no other doctrine. Chapter 2, instructions for men and women. Verse 8, if you hadn't not noted that, the word men is the word for males only. And then there is instruction concerning women also in that text. Chapter 3. Very good, yes. Qualifications of elders and deacons. And then last week, chapter 4. Yeah, some personal instructions to Timothy. Very good. This is the outline from DeWelt that we've been following. We've looked at sound doctrine, public worship, church officers, false teachers, and now we're going to look at the care of members of the church. Goes on into chapter 6, which we'll get to next time, but as he outlines it, as per his outline, care of the members of the church. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of a simple summary of what we have in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now, chapter 5 has 4 subjects, at least as I have put it together, and that is, I call this chapter instructions regarding various groups. So he starts with treatment of younger and older. He has older men, older women, younger men, younger women. Here's Timothy, how you address them and deal with them. There are principles here that apply to all of us, but particularly to young Timothy as a preacher. Here's how you deal with older men. Here's how you deal with older women. Here's how you deal with younger men, and here's how you deal with younger women. So treatment of various groups, older, younger, and older. Then there is a whole section about taking care of widows. This is where Timothy is to teach the congregation and the brethren, here's how you take care of widows. Here's who's responsible, here's who's not, here's what's to be done. Then here is a section that deals with elders. Some of it deals with their work, but it primarily deals with how you treat them, and that is support, but also it deals with accusation, and what if they are guilty of sin? How do you deal with that? That's 17 to 20. We'll get to that here in a moment. And then the rest of it I call simply personal instructions, miscellaneous things about not being hasty, not having partiality, etc. Those kinds of things we see in chapter 5. Now, let's go to our questions first, and then we'll go to the flow of our text. Let's get, no, I don't want to do that just yet. Let's hang on. I want to come back to my questions. Let's talk about this section. Your King James Version at verse 1 mentions elder. That is, rebuke not an elder. And it is often quoted in the context of it is used in the context of you don't rebuke one who is an elder in the church. Does this refer to an elder in the church? No, why? Why'd you say that, Mark? All right. In which is what the term elder means. Go ahead.
Also, the flow of the context is talking about younger being also, so flowing together can be contrasting older men.
Yes, elders would be included if they're older men, but because he talks about older men, then he talks about younger men in contrast, then he talks about older women, and then younger women. The term elder, as per the King James, simply means, as the New King James and ESV and others translates it, older man. So it has to do with showing, the whole context has to do with verses 1 and 2, showing respect with those with whom you deal. So let's work through those 4 quickly because I want to get to some other things. It's talking about basically the attitude. He's not saying that if an older person commits sin, don't say anything about that. But you wouldn't deal with them as harshly as you would your child who has done something wrong. You would talk to your child in a commanding voice. You would talk to someone younger in a stern voice. But you don't do that with someone who's older. So do not rebuke an older man. It doesn't mean you don't deal with his sin, but you exhort him as a father. What does that mean? You show respect like you would if it was your father. Now, if you cared about your father and he's in sin, would you tell him he's wrong? But how would you approach that? With love, concern, with tact, showing that you're genuinely interested. You wouldn't rebuke him like he might rebuke you. Does that make sense? So you exhort him as a father. And then he goes on in younger men as brothers. You treat younger men as if he were your brother. Treat him with respect, someone you care about. The same thing with older women. Treat them like you would your mother. You don't rebuke them severely and sternly and strongly, but you deal with them as you would to talk to your own mother. And then verse 2, the younger women as sisters. And then he adds something that's quite interesting. What is he saying and why? And the younger women as sisters, treat them like they're your sister. Then, in all purity, what does that mean? Use discretion. Why does that need to be said? To anybody, but particularly to a young preacher. Absolutely, yes. A number of preachers have got themselves in trouble because of their mishandling of women. Would you agree with that? Have you heard of cases of that? Canceling them, to get too familiar with the women because of maybe his youth and his lack of maturity. He doesn't know how to handle them as far as how to address them or how to deal with them. He thinks he has to have his hands on her. I like what Brother Patton said in his commentary. He said, preachers, especially young preachers, need to guard themselves carefully against any indiscretion that might reflect on their purity and proper conduct. Not one word, look, or action should ever suggest improper feelings on their part. Their character and usefulness depend so much upon their observance of this precept. Many preachers have ruined themselves because they did not handle themselves properly among the women. Any questions or comments? Maybe hadn't dealt with that before. I have had a rule since I started preaching, since I was married. And I was preaching before I was married. But since I'm married, that I don't talk to another woman unless she's old enough to be my mother or older. I never talk to another woman unless someone else is present or my wife is present. If she can't be there, one of the other elders or one of the older sisters or something, someone says, I want to come and talk to you alone. Nobody's here. You're not coming. You know, we're not going to do that. We just don't do that. It's just off. You bring somebody with you, or let's get one of the other elders, or let's get one of the older sisters in the congregation to come, and then we can sit down and talk. You think that's pretty good practice? To say the least, I'm not saying it's sinful if you don't. Finish my sentence. It's not sinful if you don't, but if you practice that, otherwise you're setting yourself up for failure. Exactly right. All right, let's move on. That's verses 1 and 2. Pretty simple points. Let's talk about widows in verses 3 to 16. I'm not going to list all 5 of them right now, but there are at least, I think, 5 categories of widows dealt with here in this context. He talks about older widows, and then I won't get ahead of myself. He talks about younger widows. But let's talk about older widows in verses 3 to 10, and let's work our way through verses 3 to 10. But let's go to question number 1. Who is responsible for caring for widows, verses 3 to 10 and 16? Family members, children, grandchildren, other family members. Would you agree? All right, let's get ahead and, no, let's not get ahead. Yeah, let's do. Question number 2. What does taken into the number, verse 9, mean? Yeah, the church takes on more of an ongoing, permanent enrollment. We'll get to that here in a moment. Let's talk about verse 3. Honor widows that are widows indeed. The word honor here doesn't mean just show respect for, and I'm not going to take the time to trace it. You can trace it if you want. Acts 20 and verse 10, where brethren honored Paul by giving them their needs. And I think that's how it's being used here, like it is in Acts 28 in verse 10. The widow indeed is one who is, as per the context, verse 4 and 5, is a widow that the King James says widow indeed, really a widow. The New King James, truly a widow, English Standard. It's one who has no one else to care for her. That is, there's no children. The New Living Translation says has no one else to care for them. In other words, here's a widow. She doesn't have children. She doesn't have grandchildren. She doesn't have other family. She doesn't have anyone that can take her in and take care of her and bear responsibility. That's a widow indeed. And you say, how do you know that's what that is? Well, verse 4 and verse 5, by contrast, makes that obvious to us. So honor widows that are widows indeed. That is, take care of them. Make sure they're taken care of. Now, so first of all, you honor them. Let's get verse 4 and then we'll drop down to verse 8. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first show piety at home. Proper respect is the idea of piety. At home, and repay or requite, the King James says, in other words, perform the duty, and repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. All right, what do you learn from that? All right? Show responsibility. In fact, let's drop down to verse 8. If anyone does not provide for his own, we usually quote this in the context of a father taking care of his children. Man won't take care of his own, he's denied the faith. This is really in the context talking about a child taking care of their parents. If a man doesn't provide for his own, he's denied the faith and worse than an infidel. And so here's someone that won't even take care of their parents, won't see that they have their needs taken care of. They're worse than an infidel. All right, here's the lesson I'm learning from this. If a widow becomes one in need, the first responsibility is for her to turn to her family, her children, maybe grandchildren. Quite often someone is in need, whether it's a widow or someone else, who has family who could help them. Where do they go usually? To the church. They'll ask, brethren, could y'all help? That's happened a number of times. Where could the church help in this circumstance where they may have family that has maybe a sizable amount of money that they could take care of them, but they don't want to ask their family. The church has got money, so let's ask the church. That's not a biblical principle. The principle is the family takes care of them first. Does the church ever have responsibility? Certainly so, but first of all, there's the family responsibility. So do you think it's right if someone comes to the elders and they ask, could you help us out of the church treasury? We're having a little trouble meeting our bills and needs and putting groceries on the table. Would it be right for the elders to ask about their family's financial circumstance? Parents, children, grandchildren? Yeah. Not only proper, I think this demands that, doesn't it? All right, let's go further. That's verse 4 and verse 8. Let's get 5 to 7. Here's the qualities of a widow indeed. This is one who's truly a widow. Look at verse 5. Now, she that's really a widow is left alone. Means she doesn't have anyone to care for her. What else are some of the qualities? Verse 5. She trusts in God. She puts her confidence in the Lord. Yeah, she's just faithful as she can be. She gives supplication day and night. She's a continuing praying individual. In contrast, the one who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. She doesn't live in that manner. Verse 6. Yeah, she's an encouragement to others. Verse 7. What does Paul tell Timothy to do about that? These things to give in charge or command. What'd you say, Ricky? Yeah. He's telling him to command this, that they may be blameless. I don't think he's talking about the widows being blameless. I think he's talking about the church, that they may be without blame in providing. In other words, you teach this to the church. You instruct the brethren so that they are blameless in providing for those who are in need. Otherwise, they may be providing for someone who has family to take care of them. So you teach this and you command it. You charge them, Timothy, about these matters. And then we've already covered verse 8. So now let's get verse 9 and 10. So we've already seen, I said there's classes of widows. There's a widow who has someone to care for them, children and grandchildren. There's a widow indeed who doesn't have anybody to care for them. Then there's the widow, thirdly, that could be taken into the number. So let's talk about what that number may be. Do not let a widow under 60 years of age be taken into the number, not unless she's been a wife of one man. We'll come to the qualifications here in just a second. Let's talk about her being taken into the number. I think that has reference to the permanent enrollment. It's not temporary care. In fact, give me just a second. Let me find a quotation here that may be helpful to us. Right here. Under point 4, this is from another sermon, and so don't pay attention to everything, but look right here under point 4. There is such a thing as temporary benevolence that might be to all people. It might be to young, to old, etc. There's temporary benevolence. That happened in Acts 2, that happened in Acts 4, Acts 11, that happened in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. That seemed to be a temporary emergency benevolence. But the number, Vincent says, it's the enrollment in the body of widows who are to receive church support and ongoing permanent type of help. Where there may be a widow that we just on an ongoing basis take care of her needs. We're paying her rent at in the apartment she's in. We're paying for her utilities. We may be providing food, someone to go by and take food to her, etc. Could that be done? That would fit benevolence, wouldn't it? Patton again says this verse shows that while any indigent saint may receive temporary relief, the enrollment as a permanent charge must have qualifications given here. In other words, you don't put her on the permanent roll, the enrollment, unless she meets certain qualifications. That makes sense. So here's a widow that's not going to be taken care of on an ongoing basis. That's not the widow under consideration here. This is one that may be on an ongoing basis that we take care of. So let's talk about those qualifications, verses 9 and 10. And first of all, she's to be what? Not to be older than, she is to have been the wife of one man, no adulteress. She's not to be a polygamist. What else? 60 years old, we've got that. What else? Reported of good works. In general, she is one who does good works. And she's brought up children. I mean, she's to have raised children. She's to have had a family. She's lodged strangers. She's shown hospitality. Washed the saints' feet. What does that mean? Say again. She's been a servant, exactly. Yeah. Humility, humble service. She's been an humble servant. And if she's relieved any of the afflicted, that is, she's taken care of those who are in need. She's been one who has cared for others. And she's followed every good work. As Stephen said a moment ago, it's just a description of she's to be a faithful Christian. That's the point, before she's to be taken into the number. So someone comes and says, well, my mother is, I can't take care of her, and I don't have the funds. Can you put her on the roll to take care of by the church? But she's not a Christian. We couldn't enroll her, could we? She doesn't fit the qualifications in this context. Now, any questions down through verse 10? Yeah.
I've seen it in cases before where a man that would need help that had no one.
I think my answer to that would have to be we could give him temporary help. I don't know of a principle where we could enroll him in an enrollment on a continual, ongoing. It's just perpetual till he dies.
Because it doesn't cover it in God's word.
Yeah.
I'm just curious,
And were that situation to arise, if that situation, I'm not going to leave it with this because I want to move on. If that situation were to arise, I know how this congregation here, how this congregation operates. If we let it be known, Brother so-and-so has nobody to care for them, and he needs a monthly income of, we've got to give him at least $1,000 for him to survive. He would have more than $1,000 a month to survive and never come out of the treasury.
died
Good point. Good point. Any other questions on down through verse 10? Here's the point I want you to see about widows, that here concerning older widows, that if they have family, they take care of them. That's first and foremost. And if they don't have family, the church can help take care of them. But they can't be enrolled on a permanent basis unless they meet these qualifications. So that's at least 3 categories we've talked about so far. Would you agree? All right, let's talk about younger widows now. Here's about younger widows. And the point of this, primarily, I think, is don't encourage the brethren to put the younger widows on the permanent enrollment. There may be some temporary help that could be given, but they're not to be put on the permanent enrollment. And here's why. So let's go to our questions and get these out of the way. Question number 3. What did Paul say was best for younger women? To marry? Marry? Bear children? Manage a home? Absolutely. Good point. Question number 4. How do you define gossip? We'll come to that at verse 13.
Repeating something that you have heard without knowing where it's the truth or not.
Okay, that would be included, certainly. Yeah, I like that. A tattler? Yep, that's, in fact, some translation uses the word tattler. That's right. I might know some true fact that really is nobody else's business, and I'm spreading that, and I'm meddling in other people's affairs. It obviously, yes, is saying things we should not be saying. Let's get 11 to 13. His point is to refuse them from the number. Is he saying don't give them any help at all? No. There may be temporary help. You may help them as individuals occasionally. But the younger widows, so in how do I know what you say? Well, that's kind of a vague term, younger. These, in this context, younger includes their maritable age. They're able to have children. Would you agree with that? Because he talks, they should marry and bear children. And so if they're beyond that age, that's not the point of the context. Now look at verse 11. The younger widows, he said, but refuse the younger widows. In other words, refuse them from the number. And here's why. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. Now there's a little bit of difficulty here in that we know that if she desires to marry, that's not against Christ. She can marry. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, 1 Corinthians 7 says she can marry. But I think he's talking in general terms that the point is if you enroll them and take care of them when she's of a young age where she could be industrious, be busy rearing children, taking care of a family, remarrying and raising a family, that if you just take care of her over here as a young widow, you're going to encourage laziness and the kind of lifestyle that would breed a lifestyle that goes away from God. I think that's the point. And so that's the idea here. I don't think he's saying that if she decides to remarry, that she is going against Christ. But refuse the younger women, he said, who began to grow wanton against Christ and desire to marry. And so again, he's not saying it's against Christ, but those taken in the number are to be those that are older. Now, verse 12, if she decides to go against Christ, what's the point of verse 12? she was of marriageable age, she decides to marry and may even decide to leave the Lord, according to verse 12. And shows that this was not a wise decision, obviously, to enroll her in the number. Verse 13, and besides this, they learned to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but gossips and busybodies. Now, I won't come back and define gossips and busybodies. But what's the point of verse 13? Okay, all right.
You're just giving them, you're taking care of them, they don't have to work, but they're still an individual body and therefore they need a purpose, they need something to do. So what they'll end up doing is seeking drama, action, something outside and stir up the problem with the church.
Yeah, it just encourages a idle lifestyle, which includes usually gossip and being busybodies and saying things they ought not. Let's define gossip. Gossip literally means tattlers. This is Barnes' comment. It says literally means overflowing, then overflowing with talk and pratters when they learn all the news. I won't read all of that, but I want you to get this idea that it means literally overflowing is the idea of the word gossip. A.T. Robertson, one of the richest scholars in the last 100 years, says it means to boil up like blowing soap bubbles. And so here it is, this idea of overflowing. And so they're gossips and they're prating and they're saying things that ought not be said. It may be true, it may be untrue, but they're saying things that ought not to be said. Now there's a little distinction between that and the busybodies. Verse 13, the word probably means working roundabout, overdoing, and then intermeddling. That is, meddling in other people's affairs. So you could be gossiping and maybe not meddling, being a busybody, or you could be a busybody and you may not be gossiping, but those overlap a great deal. Does that make sense? Kind of hard to separate them. They're so overlapped, you tear one out, you're going to tear part of the other one out as well. They're meshed together. They're tattlers and they're busybodies, speaking things that indeed they ought not. More comments on verse 13, tattlers and busybodies. All right, let's go back to the text and let's talk about what she should do. This is Paul's answer to the problem of verse 13. You enroll a woman into the number and you're going to create a gossip is probably what you'll do. So he said, instead of doing that, I would encourage them to get married, bear children, and manage the house. That is, this is that cure. So charge them to work at home, raising their children, being a homemaker. I think the New American Standard says she's to keep house. Instead of guide the house, it says keep house, which is parallel to Titus 2 in verse 5. She's to be a keeper at home. Questions or comments on verse 14 of what she's to be? Marry, bear children. What does it mean, give no occasion to the adversary? Yes. And when she's doing this, when she marries and she's raising a family and she's a keeper at home, the critic has no reason to criticize her. Doesn't mean they won't criticize her. They have no reason to, no justifiable reason. And they have no reason to bring reproach upon her. Make sense? Now, verse 15 said, and this is Paul's evidence. I think this is his evidence column. Evidence as to why this is so important. And proof that this is good judgment. What's he say? Some have already turned aside. Apparently some young widows, I don't know if they've been enrolled in the number. Maybe that's why this instruction needs to be charged. Some have already turned aside, he said, verse 15. So younger widows, don't put them in that number. You encourage them to remarry and to bear children and guide the house. You teach them to have the godly family. The older widows are to be taken care of. And so we're seeing a number of classes of widows here. Now, verse 16, one more thing about widows. There's the older widows, there's the younger widows, and then here's who's to care for widows. Verse 16, what does it say? Yeah, if any man or woman has a widow, let them relieve them, and let not the church be burdened or charged. In other words, my mother's gone, but if my mother was living and somebody needed to take care of her, that's my responsibility rather than asking a church where she worshiped or here to take care of her, right? But a widow who is a widow indeed can be taken care of by the church. What do you learn from verse 16 about the church and the individual? Different responsibilities. You won't find a clear verse in the New Testament that distinguishes the individual and the church. When you talk to people and they say there's no difference in the church and the individual, this passage is, as Brother Grider used to say, unget-overable. I don't think there is such a term, but anyway.
I think in this section, Donnie, we see restrictions and guidelines for the church money. I think we draw that conclusion easily.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, we have some ground to go. Let's talk about elders, verses 17 to 20. And because there's some time to go, I want us to quickly, this is not an unimportant section, but let's get 17 and 18. Count them worthy of double honor. What's the point of double honor? Verse 17. Let elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor. I think it's the idea that you're to honor elders, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. If they are the men they should be, they deserve respect for the office, whether you respect the person himself or not. So the double honor has reference to there may be a time where you support them financially for that work. How do I know that's what he's talking about? Well, verse 18, he says, and he quotes from Deuteronomy 25, you do not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. And then there's a quotation from Jesus in Luke 10 and in verse 7 that the laborer is worthy of his wages. One from the Old Testament, one from the New. And that same argument is made in 1 Corinthians 9 that argues for financial support of preachers. Same argument. So in interest of time, rather than opening up the floor, is this passage saying you can pay an elder for his work? And the answer is yes. I think this is talking about full-time pay. I've known of cases where there were full-time elders who were paid out of the church treasury. I personally have not known any, but would it be scriptural if we had a man that needed to be supported? In other words, he didn't have support elsewhere, and he's going to devote his time full time to doing the work of an elder, involving teaching, involving visiting and taking care of needs, etc. Would it be right to pay him out of the church treasury for that, for a full-time job? Yes, and the answer, yes, is clear. So count them worthy of double honor, he said. All right. Now, what about if there's an accusation against an elder? Verse 19, do not receive an accusation without 2 or 3 witnesses. What's that about? I mean, what's the point?
Sure you have your facts.
All right, be sure you have your facts. But why does he mention that with elders? Now, that is in a sense true with everybody. But why does he mention that right here?
Elders in a leadership responsibility in the congregation, and the eyes are on him at all the time. So if you got something to say against him, you need to have 2 or 3 people there to establish the truth.
Yes. I've not seen it so much in this congregation. I have been in congregations where accusations are being fired all the time at one of the elders because that elders had to deal with this family at some point. Maybe withdraw from some of their relatives. So they're firing all the time at this elder, or maybe elders. And we'd have to remind people, do you have any evidence of that? No, I don't have any. Then hush, because we're not going to listen to it. If you can bring a witness, and then another witness, and another witness, then we'll sit down and we'll listen. Otherwise, we're dismissing that. And that's a biblical principle. Now, if it can be well established, what do you do? Verse 20.
Rebuke him in front of the whole assembly, that the others might take heed.
Yes. Is it proper and right to charge an elder with sin and ask him to be removed, and if he's unwilling to resign, tell him we'll no longer recognize you as one of our elders? Is that proper? Yeah. That's what this text is talking about. When it's well established that indeed he is in sin. Now let's get to personal instructions in the last few minutes we've got. These are various instructions. So let's get, I'm going to jump through this a little bit. Look at verse 22 first. Keep yourself pure. That's pretty obvious because I'm going to come back to the others. But I want to get the partiality, verse 21, and lay hands suddenly on no man. So let me jump to that just for a moment. All of this that Timothy is to do in his preaching and teaching is to be without prejudice or without partiality. The King James says without preferring one before another, without judging beforehand. Notice the last line, I think, gets a pretty good summary of this. That in Timothy's approach to dealing with people, make sure that he doesn't allow friendship, position, money, and emotions to cloud his view of others. As a young preacher, could that be a problem? The guy that's putting in most of the money in the congregation where he preaches is in sin, and he's afraid to deal with it because he may lose the funds. That's his money. That's where his salary comes from. Don't let that bother you. Don't let that bother you. Someone in your friendship that needs to be dealt with and you don't want to deal with it because they're a friend, don't let that get in the way. Do it all without partiality and without prejudice. Make sense? Yeah, treat everybody the same. And so without partiality, D. Welch says, prejudice is preference by prejudgment. Partiality is choice made of personal advantage. I like that distinction. Now let's talk about being hasty. Now this is a little bit more difficult to me. And I wanted to get to this if we didn't get to anything else. Do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. So what does it mean to lay your hands on someone? Well, that term lay on of hands was used in Acts 13 as an appointment to a work. Sometimes it had to do with laying on of hands and imparting a spiritual gift. I understand that. But Paul is telling Timothy not to lay hands on someone suddenly. So that he's not going to be imparting spiritual gifts. He's not an apostle. Some think, because of the context, it has reference to the appointing of elders. And he's just talked about elders. Some think it has to do encouraging others to preach or teach. Maybe it includes both. All right. So his point is, don't be hasty in appointing elders or appointing others to teach. Would you agree with that? All right, here's why. He said, don't do it suddenly, hastily. Your Revised Version says, do not approach hastily. Because when you do, you share in other people's sins. How so?
Put the man in a position when he has the wrong motive for being in a position.
Absolutely. So when I encouraged him, I was the one who put his name forward. I encouraged him. I argued that he ought to be an elder. He was put in, and now the church goes south. Who bears responsibility? The elder who misled, but also me. I bear in other people's sins. Make sense? So don't be hasty. In other words, this is a time for wisdom and judgment. Take time. We make a mistake. That when a person is baptized, a man is baptized, and as soon as we get him dried off from the baptistry, we tell him he needs to be making talks. He needs to be teaching. You think it's wise? Why? He's still a babe. He's got to have time to learn. Not everybody's cut out for that just yet. So don't lay hands suddenly. Don't be hasty in appointing people, Timothy, to teach, to be elders. Take time, use wisdom. And it's going to save you some heartache. Does that make sense? Well, we're not done, but we are done.